All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining from all parts of the world. Welcome to the Fireside Chat with Rebecca Henderson, hosted by One League. Welcome to those of you new to One League. Welcome to One League fellows, faculty, global mentors, and friends, and a very, very warm welcome to you, my very special guest, Rebecca Henderson. So now, for those of you new to One League is a global institution connecting the world's highest potential change makers to world-class education and opportunities offered in collaboration with Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. We strive to create a new class of conscientious and mindful global leadership using the power of business, global entrepreneurship, and data, and challenge the status quo to create a meaningful, positive impact both locally and globally all around the world. So today's talk couldn't be more pertinent and more critical for our community, but also for the world at large. As you listen to Rebecca today, please put in chat as we go along. So during the conversation, your most important takeaways from today's conversation, what you're learning, what is making a mark on you, what you might want to take action on. And we'll be sharing your remarks with your permission on social media to raise awareness for this very important topic. And I'll also leave the last 15 or so minutes of today's conversation for live questions from the audience. Now, it's possible to create a better, more sustainable future, but only if we act with urgency and in concert with one another. This belief has driven Rebecca's work for the last 10 years and is at the heart of her latest book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, published in 2020, a book I have now, Rebecca, read twice, and that I would highly, highly recommend to everyone. A renowned and highly influential economist and educator as the John Natty MacArthur University professor at Harvard, Rebecca is one of the world's most articulate, insightful, and persuasive scholars focused on driving large-scale change. She's been a leading authority in organizational and strategic change for more than 30 years, and today her research, teaching, and speaking centers on purpose-driven capitalism and the role that business leaders at every level can play in reimagining our current system. Rebecca leads the most successful MBA elective course for the last 5 years, Reimagining Capitalism, at Harvard Business School. She also teaches in HBS's executive education program and is a research fellow at the National Bureau for Economic Research, a sustainability advisor to several of the world's largest corporations, and a board member at Amgen, amongst others, that are S&P 500 companies. So Rebecca, it's a true honor and a privilege to have you with us today on this very special day, marking the first day of Women's History Month. What better way to celebrate than someone making history as we speak? We're so delighted to have you here at One League.
Umaima, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your very kind words.
You're so very welcome. Rebecca, you say, I grew up British. Those are the words that you open your book, Reimagining Capitalism, with. We'd love to start at the beginning. So we'd love to know what you were like as a child and what you call tumultuous upbringing was like.
What was I like as a child? I'm not sure any of us really know what we were like as children. I was very serious. I studied very hard, and I loved walking in the forests and the woods. And as for it being tumultuous, this was England in the 60s and 70s. And I found it very difficult to be female in British society. You know, people sometimes say to me, why did you emigrate to the United States? And there's one story I tell which really catches it for me. I went to one of the most academic girls' schools in England, St. Paul's Girls' School in London, for those who know London. And I studied physics, maths, and chemistry at the advanced level, one of only 11 women in the school to do that. And one day we had a visitor from the Department of Trade and Industry, and his mission was to persuade us girls to go into industry. And so he stood up on the stage and he made his pitch to the whole school. And at the end, the headmistress said, well, does anyone have any questions? And I put up my hand and I said, I'm thinking of emigrating to the United States because I think opportunities may be better there. And he looked at me, and in front of the entire school, he said, oh, it would be a pity to lose someone as pretty as you. And I thought, okay, I'm out of here. Now, this is a long time ago, and England has moved a very long way, but I have never forgotten that. And I went as an undergraduate to MIT, which I loved, because it seemed to me, at least, and maybe I was fortunate, that it didn't matter if I was purple and had tentacles growing out of the top of my head. As long as I was smart and had good ideas, that was all that mattered. And I know MIT is not perfect, but that was my experience. It was quite wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And your early education leading up to your first job out of college, working for large consulting companies, closing plants in England. Can you tell us a little bit about that, as well as then you proceeded to become a chaired professor at MIT, where you studied, and your experience there?
Sure. So I left MIT, went back to London to check I really did want to emigrate. And as you say, I ended up working for a consulting company, closing plants in Northern England. And that was really an experience that shaped my whole life. I remember one evening being on site at a client company, and we were supervising the movement of the computers out of the factory, because the next day we were going to shut the factory down and we knew the workforce would violently object. And I was struck both by the human suffering that was being created by the need to close this factory, and by the fact that this was a 100-year-old brand name. Why was this company failing? I could see that the economy was doing fine. And so I got very, very interested in why people, and large organizations in particular, find it so difficult to change. And yes, a few years later, I ended up as the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management, working on innovation and change in large organizations. And the fact that I got the Eastman Kodak chair was a complete coincidence, but really deeply ironic, because look what happened to Kodak.
Interesting. Yeah. And so this question of why is it so difficult to create change? Just, I know, over the years, your perspective might have changed on that, but as you were looking at those companies in that period of time, what were your insights then?
So 20 years of research in 2 minutes, right? No problem. I once tried to describe my research to a taxi driver. It was a very long taxi ride. And at the end, he said, so I can get a PhD from Harvard for finding that big firms get fat and lazy and have trouble doing new things. And I said, wow, it's much more expensive and much more complicated than that. But in some ways, it's not more complicated than that. So why is organizational change so hard? Firstly, because groups don't see what's happening. Both individuals and organizations develop cognitive filters, things they choose to look at, things they know it's safe to ignore. Mostly, large organizations divide problems up into pieces, and everyone takes a piece, whether it's marketing or sales or engines or door handles, but everyone focuses on their little piece, and they assume that the rest of the world is staying stable. And we could get more technical about this, but what it means is that large successful companies and large successful people are often the last to know when the world is shifting around them. They are subconsciously and consciously filtering out the information that might tell them. So that's the first problem. Large firms say it's not happening. And I worked with Nokia as Apple was coming on strong, trying to persuade them that the smartphone was an issue. I mean, my 10-year-old son knew at the time that smartphones were an issue, but trying to persuade Nokia, who was selling 1 million phones a week, that they really had to do things differently, well, you can tell I didn't succeed, because where's Nokia now? So we don't see it. The second problem is large organizations decide they won't make any money at doing the new thing.
Mm.
So real innovation tends to disrupt business models as well as technology. It disrupts channels to market, customers want new things. And so the knee-jerk response is, we won't make any money. If it is happening, well, maybe it's happening, we won't make any money. And then the third problem, when they finally decided that, just to take an example at random, okay, climate change is real, all right, if we don't do anything, we can lose money, and maybe we can do money if we make money if we pay attention, okay. Third problem, oh, I'm busy. My organization is fundamentally overloaded. I don't know how to act in new ways. I often say it's as if you take someone who's really good at golf and tell them that they need to play tennis. And yes, it's just hitting a ball with something on the end of a stick, but that transition is hard. So just building the new organizational muscle to act in new ways is hard. So to summarize, it's not happening, we won't make any money, and we can't get it done.
Fascinating, fascinating. It just makes me think, organizations are sum of individuals, and this is all just, sort of human psychological biases and fear and, confirmation bias and all those things that,
Well, you wanted me to short circuit the 20 years of research, but the relationship between the individual, the group, and the firm is complicated and interactive, but yes, mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, 100%. Fascinating. So your book, Reimagining Capitalism, it's a result of 15-year exploration of why and how we can build profitable, equitable, sustainable capitalism by changing how we think about, one, the purpose of the firm, two, their role in society, and as you said, three, their relationship to government and the state, and it is a complicated beast. We'll break it all down and talk about each of these aspects in detail. So let's start with the purpose of the firm. The book, I felt, did a fantastic job recounting the history of capitalism as we know it today. So Rebecca, would you tell us what is the purpose of a firm from a historical perspective, and how did we get to decide so?
Again, I'm summarizing a long, complicated history, but corporations were originally invented to serve society. The goal was to give the people who gave capital to the firm limited liability so that they wouldn't lose everything they had if the firm went bankrupt. And the thought was that would enable the concentration of capital that would then lead to goals that the society liked. Here in the United States, that meant things like building bridges and roads. In the UK, it meant creating the East India Company, which was responsible for genocide on a large scale and slavery and lots of uncomfortable things, but did make British society quite rich. So, these things are always double-edged, but the original conception was always that the corporation is in service to the society and the state. And these things come and go in fashion, but that conception held for much of the 19th century. And indeed, as late as the early 1980s, the Business Roundtable said business exists to serve multiple stakeholders and grow the prosperity of the society. That was quite conventional. And firms like General Electric tracked their impact on different stakeholders and so on. It was considered quite normal. What really changed that is a revolution in economic thinking that began right after World War II, but really culminated in the very early 80s. We associate people like Milton Friedman and Hayek with this movement, but it basically said, wait. If you tell business they have multiple goals and this vague thing serving society, they can do anything they want. Maybe they'll serve society, maybe they'll just buy private jets for their wives and mistresses. We want people making money for shareholders. It's shareholder money, that should be their role. And that position really took off big time for many, many reasons. One, it made many managers and many shareholders very, very rich. So that was helpful. And it seemed to offer an answer, right? Just put your head down, make profits, you're done. The trouble is, if you're in a society where markets are not perfect and externalities are not properly priced, making profit, maximizing profit doesn't necessarily maximize social welfare. To be concrete, if you can throw greenhouse gases out of the window for free and collude to drive wages to the bottom and I particularly like this one, corrupt the political process so you halt the implementation of antitrust, that market is not free or fair. And maximizing profits will make a lot of money for shareholders, but not necessarily make the society better off. Or even more simply, a lot of people got very rich, and we're now looking at a world on fire and societies in free fall. And this is not good. And, you know, you might think I'm exaggerating, I'm caricaturing, but the science is truly frightening. The world is heating much faster than the scientists expected, and the effects are much stronger. And we're seeing deep polarization and the rise of authoritarianism, not just in the US, but in societies across the world. I see it in response to many things, but one is many people have been left behind. They feel betrayed by the so-called elites. And they're like, well, you know, you have made a real mess of it. Let's have someone else fix this. So it's a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And one of the things that I was very encouraged to read in detail in your book about was access to opportunity. You know, so when we think about markets not being efficient, individual freedoms, access to opportunity not being equally distributed, especially when it comes to access to education, which is something that we think a lot about here at One League. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So let me start by making it very clear that I'm a huge fan of capitalism when it works well. You know, some people see the mess we're in and say, let's just tear the whole system down. Let's start over. And I think that's a seriously bad idea for all kinds of reasons. But the most obvious is that the vitality, innovation, and capacity of capitalism at its best, it's the way it spurs competition. It gives everybody opportunity. It pulls people into the market. It's no longer dependent on who you know or who your grandfather knew as to what your economic prospects are. Those aspects of capitalism are amazing. GDP per head has more than quintupled in the last 100 years, at the same time as the world's population has more than tripled. That's modern science and technology for sure. That's modern institutions of democracy and a free press for sure, but it's also capitalism. It's also that competition and turning that science and technology into goods and services people want. And so it's not that I think, oh, we should get rid of capitalism. It's we should fix capitalism. And the issue you pointed to is one of the number one exhibits as to why. Because it's now, this is really distressing to me. Here in the US, the odds of moving into the top decile of income, the top 10% of income, if you're born in the bottom 10%, the odds that you'll do that are lower now in the US than they are in most other countries in the developed world. We now have lower levels of social mobility. And that is just, to me, a total abnegation of the promise of capitalism. And I pick the US, of course, levels of social mobility are not high in many parts of the world. And here's the thing, capitalism at its best gives everyone a chance, pulls everyone in. But if you are born to two parents who have no education, who are working day and night, if you have to walk to your school, learn in a school with no books, if you don't have decent healthcare, the odds of your succeeding go down. No, of course. I had a PhD student who's now a very eminent professor at the University of Michigan, who was born in Cameroon and learned reading and mathematics on the floor of a hut from missionaries. He is amazing. So it's not that it can't be done. And of course, I have enormous admiration for people who succeed despite those odds. It's just, it seems to me unfair. My son was born in Cambridge. He went to the best schools. The house was full of books. He's succeeded. But, it's as if we give a large share of people weights on their feet and put them 50 yards behind the starting line. And so that's bad for capitalism. It's bad for firms. We need all the talent we can get. We need all the economic growth we can get. So we talk more about that later. But in principle, we need, to keep developing new products and services. And so education is key. Equal opportunity is key. And can I just say, creating decent jobs that pay properly and treat people with decent respect, with decency and respect, that's also really important.
Yeah, 100%. To dive a little bit deeper into this. So you say in the book, profit maximization only increases prosperity and freedom when markets are genuinely free and fair. Modern capitalism is neither. So let's turn our focus a little bit to that. And the first aspect of reimagining capitalism that you talk about is what you call the first piece of the puzzle, is creating shared value. So tell us, what do you mean by that?
Sure. So my underlying idea is firms exist to serve society, not to maximize profits. So the goal is to create a thriving and prosperous society. Maximizing profits, making profits, is a means to an end. It's a very necessary means to an end. I have more than 25 years of public board experience. I understand you need to make money, but it doesn't have to be a whole goal. So when I say let's create shared value, I mean exactly that. Let us orient the corporation so that it makes money for investors and can cover its bills, but also creates value for society. Now, of course, most corporations do this most of the time, right? If I'm making toothpaste, that's creating value for society. I need toothpaste. But it's a shift in emphasis. It does two things. Firstly, it suggests that in those cases of firms that are actively destroying value with every unit they sell, think coal-fired power plants, that's a problem. And because burning coal creates so much damage to human health and to the climate, that damage is larger for the average coal-fired plant than the total revenues of the plant, let alone the profits. So that if we had that rule, there are some businesses we wouldn't want to be in. And secondly, it says when push comes to shove, we try and invest in things that create more social value rather than less. Every decision we make, we think, can we make a difference? Can we help? Can we drive things forward? That's shared value. And I think there's a lot of evidence that there's lots of it around, that it is absolutely possible to make money and contribute to society at the same time.
In fact, one of the examples that you share, and I wonder if you could briefly share that with us, is the Unilever Kenyan tea plantation case.
Sure, I love that case. I love that case for a couple of reasons. One is the hero was not the CEO. The hero was not the divisional president. The hero is the marketing manager of the tea business, which, may I say, was not and is not that sexy a business. I mean, teabag tea, not very sexy. And he took over the position of marketing manager for Lipton Tea, one of Unilever's biggest brand. And he said, whoa, this is a problem. We have a commodity product whose price is going backwards, that consumers see no differentiation. And we got to do something. And here's the exciting thing. He went around the whole business asking for ideas like, what can we do? Can we make a difference? And he came to a tea plantation in Kenya, one of the few that Unilever owned, where they had invested deeply in reducing the environmental impacts of growing tea and improving the way they treated the workforce. So they paid way over the odds to tea pickers, who are notoriously abused labor force. They were reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, their pesticide runoffs. They were using homegrown fertilizer, and was fabulous. And it was producing lots more tea than any other plantation in the system, like twice as much. So that was an example where you could do a lot better. And that led Michelle to say, okay, let's do sustainable tea. Let's brand ourselves as sustainable tea. We know that we won't get anyone to pay any more because it's just a tea bag, but maybe we'll get share gain. And it took them, I'm not going to get the exact number, but between 6 months and a year to persuade senior management to let them do this, because it's expensive. To announce that you're going to only buy sustainably grown tea and to train all the growers. They launched massive training programs, tens of thousands of trainers, training tea farmers on the ground, certifying the tea. And senior management was like, "Ooh, that's rather a lot of money. Will we get it back?" But they got it back. They got it back. Again, not a perfect business, always issues. But one of the exciting things is they tipped the entire tea industry into becoming more sustainable. Still not perfect, but everyone has commitments. Everyone is being audited. Definitely progress.
Mm-hmm. And I see in chat, Andrew speaks to the role of investors. So that was actually going to be my next question, which is, you say, traditional finance may be the single biggest stumbling block to reimagining capitalism. And one of the key pieces that you talk about is to rewire finance. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. So there are a couple of problems with conventional finance. One is it tends to focus very much on the short term. Most investment managers are managed on very short timeframes. What did you do for me this year? And so they're very focused on, this year's returns. And the second problem is they're very focused on things you can measure through conventional means. So, for example, when the CEO of Unilever, Doug McMillon, announced that he was going to very significantly raise wages, I think he said he was going to spend $1 billion more on employee compensation. And he said, I'm going to do this because we pushed wages down too far, productivity is suffering, innovation is suffering, employee commitment is suffering, we have turnover problems, all quite well documented. I'm going to really raise wages. Stock price fell by nearly 20% in a day. Now, I think it's a reasonable speculation that if the Walmart board hadn't had a founding father, literally a Walton, as board chair, and I think they have a controlling issue on the board, he might have been fired. It would certainly have been an uncomfortable position. And so it's hard to do things that pay off in the longer term. And what made it doubly hard is Doug said things like, productivity is low, this will really increase it. And the investors are like, yeah, show me. So we don't have an agreed upon set of metrics for doing this kind of thing. How do you show that investing in employee compensation will increase productivity and long-term success? And similarly with carbon, if a firm says, I don't have much carbon risk, or I'm setting a target and that's going to go down well with employees and consumers, if you can't measure it, if you don't have a metric which is verifiable, auditable, and replicable, you just have hot air. And that's a problem for investors. It's also a problem for employees and customers. So two things need to happen. We need to think about shifting the incentives for investment managers, not so that they don't care about making decent returns on the stock, got to make decent returns, fiduciary duty to your clients. But for example, if you're running a pension fund, your owners, the pensioners, they have a much longer time horizon than a year. They might care about the fact that the world might burn up or destabilize, and massive droughts and floods could have hundreds of millions of people migrating north. If you're a pensioner, you might care about that. At the very least, we should be having the conversation about what the long-term incentives are. And the other thing we need is better metrics that everybody agrees on, that can be audited, just like financial metrics. And this is the whole revolution that's out there now, which is called the ESG revolution. And I think one of the ways you can show it's really getting traction is it's made certain segments of the American political establishment really unhappy. The House of Representatives just passed a bill saying that pensions could not take account of the risk of climate change in making their financial investments, which is very weird, because you can make a very strong case that for many firms, you're an insurance company insuring houses in beachfront property, for example, thinking about climate change is like really very much in the interests of your shareholders. So there's a very interesting conversation going on here, but the fact that it's so public is, I think, a indication of how seriously people are taking these issues.
Yeah. And I want to kind of go deep a little bit into one of the things that we've been talking about is externalities, how to price externalities, even be aware of externalities. I think in the book, you give a very powerful example. Every time we use fossil fuels, whether it's to drive a car or to take a flight, we're creating lasting damage that we're not paying for. Love for you to share a bit more about, that perspective, but also, do we expect customers to then eventually pay for externalities? And how do we think about both the emerging world and the developed world, and the fact that, it is not everybody has equal access to means and resources, and who would in the end really end up paying for this?
No fair. Two questions in one. Let me do the externalities first, and externalities and should customers pay. So Imagine I have in my hands $10 worth of electricity, a cloud of electrons made by burning $10 worth of coal, right? Burning $10 worth of coal will get you about $10. Yeah, sorry, $10 worth of electricity made by burning coal. That will power your cell phone for about 9-10 years. Pretty good deal. Here's the issue. In burning the coal that went into making that electricity, there were a whole bunch of toxic pollutants generated that cause, according to my colleagues in the School of Public Health, at least $8 worth of damage to human health. Millions of people die every year because we continue to burn coal and drive oil-fired cars. It also causes climate damage. And my friends in the economics department say it also causes about $8 worth of climate change damage. And both the public health people and the economists say those are lower bound estimates. So this $10 worth of coal-fired electricity causes on average about $16 worth of damage to the society and to future generations. So should consumers pay? Well, hell yes. I'm using the electricity to power my cell phone. It's not fair. In fact, I'm imposing this damage on people least likely to be able to fight back, future generations who have no say. And most of the health damage goes to disadvantaged communities who have very few resources to be able to contest this. So in effect, this is extreme, but just to make the point, those of us who are rich and privileged are burning fossil fuels, not paying for the damage, and imposing that damage on the less developed world, the developing world, less privileged world, which can be right here in the US or right here in Europe, and on future generations. That seems to me morally completely unacceptable. And the easiest way, if you're an economist, to fix the climate crisis is to say, consumers use it, consumers pay for it. Now, all kinds of political issues, but that's kind of one just solution. And believe me, if we'd done that 15 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about the climate crisis. The cost of fixing it 15 years ago would have been about 3% of GDP. We would have the technologies in place. We wouldn't be facing the massive wall of suffering we're looking at now. But that's okay. We are where we are. We got to do what we got to do. Now, your second question. All consumers? Like, you should pay more, Rebecca. I get that. But, what about people in, say, somewhere in South America who have like minimal electricity, maybe none? Should they, should we be raising their power prices? That doesn't really seem very fair. To which I say, absolutely, I agree with you. And again, in the best of all possible worlds, I would like to see a massive transfer of technology and resources from the richer parts of the world, that includes, the centers of cities, to those who have less. And the business case I would make for that, in some ways, my whole book is a business case for addressing this problem, is I know it's expensive now, but not doing it will be much, much more expensive later. And the trouble is we live in a world where, we don't like investing for the long term. So it's a puzzle. I mean, I am sure we will address these issues. The question will be how much damage will have been done by the time we do it. I mean, we're seeing technology advance much faster. I'm a technology booster. I taught technology strategy at MIT, and the price of renewable energies has come down much faster than any of us expected. Now, we need to completely transform the transportation industry, the construction industry, information technology, food, agriculture. I could go on. It's like roughly half the economy needs to be completely transformed. But the good news is that would create millions of jobs, lots of profit, and we would have a much cleaner, much more pleasant world on the other side that didn't have a radically destabilized climate. So the overall business case is totally easy to make. And we have many, many papers, which I'm sure you shared with your students and everyone on the call about how to do this. I mean, we know how to do this transition. We just have to decide to do it.
We just have to decide to do it. And to parse out the roles, who does it? What is the role in your mind of government? What is the role of business? And you speak of, business really influencing government, rebuilding our institutions and fixing our government.
Right.
Does business have a role to fix government?
So I think business has an important role to play. I don't think business is the solution, or business can do it alone, but business working in concert with civil society and the government can address these issues. So how should we think about that? Let's get back to rebalancing capitalism. How do we rebalance capitalism so that externalities are properly priced or controlled and everybody has a shot at competing? Well, that means strengthening the state, strengthening democratic capacity, and, hate to say it, but pushing back against the corruption that enables a few rich people to dictate policy priorities. So what we're talking about is rebalancing markets and democracy. In so many places, markets have got so strong that they have essentially over-toppled democracy and or lessened their power. And of course, many people in the elites didn't fight back. For years, it was fashionable. Oh, market solution, market solution, market solution. I'm an economist. I love market solutions. I love prices. I love ways to, but you need to have real political muscle to focus on the long term, to make sure that excluded communities are included, to make sure that externalities are priced, because firms hate that. The easy thing to say is no more taxes, no more regulation. We hate that stuff. And that's a kind of knee-jerk reaction. So we need to rebalance market and the state. That's huge. I'm essentially talking about a major social change. The only way we've seen it historically is through war and revolution or fundamental social mobility. So huge cultural and social movements, like the movements that addressed women's equality, racial equality, gender and trans equality, these kinds of massive social movements, that's what we need if we're going to rebalance. Now, what's the role of business? A couple of roles. One, stop acting egregiously badly. That would be really helpful. So campaign reform laws, being very transparent about your spending on your political spending. Two, be helpful. Stand up and say, free markets need free societies, because they do. All the research suggests that you have to have a free society to really have a thriving free market. As the society gets less free, as democracies fail, what you get is crony capitalism. Look at Russia. I have a friend who's Hungarian. He has a small business. It's doing quite well. I said, are you going to grow the business? He said, no, I'm not going to grow it. If I grow it, the prime minister's cousin will take it. And he meant it quite literally. In Hungary now, who gets the contracts? Who gets the breaks? How are the regulations enforced? It all depends on what politician you know. Look at China. I think they're at risk of going very much in the crony capitalism direction, because when you give a small group of people that much power, the incentive to use it to enrich yourself and your friends is overwhelming. We need free societies. They are messy, they are complicated, but that sense that we belong to each other and we have a shared value and a shared way of doing things, it's vital to shared prosperity. And business can play a big role in that too. There's some evidence that for the majority of people in the world, the single institution they trust the most is, get this, the firm they work for. And so to the degree that firms stand up and say, climate change is real, everybody should get a good job, we need to treat different people, people the same regardless of their gender and their skin color and their national origin. When they start to say things, and when they say democracy really matters, go and vote, take the day off, that's really helpful. And indeed, in my book, I outline 3 stories about times when firms really stepped forward and helped put in place and really cement a strong, open society. It has happened before. I think we're at risk of needing it to happen again.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Now, as I asked Rebecca my final question, I would love for all of you to put your questions in chat, and vote them up for questions that you would really want to make sure Rebecca gets the chance to answer. I will then call on you to ask your questions live, so be prepared to ask those questions. And for One League Fellows, please feel free to write the questions that you've already shared with us in preparation of today's event. Everyone, Rebecca, watch your TED Talk. And again, I would encourage
you should have told me that. I would use a different example.
There's a lot of other people who are also not fellows, so we have on here, but our One League Fellows, all of our students did watch the TED Talk, which I'm sure everyone enjoyed really a lot. And so please feel free to include the questions that you've already prepared or new questions that come to mind based on this conversation today. Rebecca, my last question to you, it's a big undertaking, yet, you know, we can boil this down to what each of us individually can do. So today you have One League Fellows, you have our global mentors who are, you know, like myself, graduates of, you know, HBS, but also MIT, Stanford, just incredible industry leaders. You have One League faculty joining as well. So for all of us, if you could share with us, you know, some of the ways that we can think about the change that we can make today. If I could make it a little bit of a two-part question, I know that a big part of that is discovering your own purpose, as you talk about. So if you could also share with us your why and your purpose for doing this work.
You know, I'm really keen to get to question and answer. So I don't think I want to share my own why. I want to tease everyone who's on the call. It's in the book, it's in the last chapter. And I can push the book because I don't make any money from it. All profits go to an organization called Mothers Out Front, which lobbies for climate change policies. Yeah, it's too much to share in 5 minutes. But I can talk about personal purpose and what we might do once you've decided what your purpose is, because you're quite right. I think it's really important to know why you care and to be able to stand in that purpose. But then you can think about operating at 3 levels: personal, professional, and political. So personally, try and fly less, try and eat less meat. If you have a house, try and insulate it, put solar panels on the roof if you can. Do what you can, treat other people with decency and respect, because we know that social contagion is very real, that people are very influenced by the people around them. And in doing these things, you open up the opportunity for conversation. Yes, I care about these issues. Yes, they're real. What do you think about them? Open and invite other people into conversation at the personal level. Secondly, professionally, my hope is many of the people on this call, if they're not already professionals in leading organizations, will be soon. And to go back to my story of Michelle Legence, we tend to think that it's CEOs or prime ministers or presidents who drive these changes. They don't. They're too busy. They're just trying to get through the day. It's very helpful to have their support, but the best way to get their support is to push them. When Paul Pullman joined Unilever and transformed the firm completely, one of the reasons he could do that was there were 4 or 5 initiatives like the Tea Initiative in the firm that had been started locally by people who really cared. People in his office saying, sustainability, Paul, that's the way to go. You have much more influence than you think you do. I know so many CEOs who embrace this agenda because their employees insisted that they must. So professionally, take this seriously. What can the organization you work with do, and how can it engage? And lastly, politically, get involved, get engaged. Mothers Out Front, which is the NGO to which I give the profits from the book, not that there are very many profits from the book, is, but I give them to Mothers Out Front. What they have discovered is if you can get 20 informed, active, angry mothers in a legislator's office, you'd be surprised by how much change you can drive. Politics is local. You can make a difference where you live and where you are. And last but not least, do all of this with other people. None of us alone can shift the world. The problems are far too big. We need an avalanche, and that means we need many, many pebbles to start rolling. And so each of us is a pebble. No one knows who's going to trigger the avalanche, but there is power in numbers, external power and emotional power. Much easier to do this work. If you work together with friends at work or people near where you live, find a group that shares your values and work together with them.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, for that. Fantastic. So we're going to open it up to questions. And first question, I would love to invite Tangulu from Kazakhstan. If Tangulu, you could please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Rebecca, for your inspiring and giving hope discussion. The question I have is, how do we keep politicians? Well, basically, we've touched upon that, but how do we keep politicians and big corporations responsible for the way they do businesses? For example, like BlackRock, which invests a lot into the oil industry, and all the people, like basically almost every human being that invests in the capital markets are actually supporting the all the harmful industry for the environment. So how do we keep them? How do we make this shift so that they take the responsibility?
With difficulty. Our best bet is through the ballot box. So through democratically enacted legislation. The single thing that would make the most difference with respect to both labor policy and carbon and environmental policy is rigorous regulation, ideally designed in partnership with the private sector so that it worked. That was binding regulation. That's happened before. It could happen again, but it needs a strong democratic movement that has these goals at its core. If we don't have that, we do have other levers. I wasn't joking about employees and customers. So far, we've not seen much customer movement. I think most purchases are too small and people are moving too fast to really bring their values to bear when they're buying anything. The exception to that is construction, housing, where I know a lot of real estate developers who, believe me, are not very tree hugging, but they say their customers are insisting that they're at least making some significant investment in conservation, in energy use reduction, in low energy materials. So in those places where the customer is making a major purchase, the customer has a lot of power. Employees have a ton of power in certain kinds of firms, in certain kinds of labor markets. So why are all the tech companies at least nominally so green? Because their employees insist that they are. So as employees, we have some power. As investors, we potentially have power. Exercising it is tricky because to the degree to which our money is tied up in pension funds, many pensioners don't even have the choice of investing in, say, a green fund. And we don't yet have good metrics to tell you that the fund really is green. But beginning to exert some kind of democratic control over finance is critical. In my book, I tell the story of the Japanese government pension fund, which had a amazingly innovative and slightly out there chief investment officer called Hiro Mizuno. And he decided that climate change and gender discrimination were the two largest threats to long-term Japanese economic growth, which is not crazy. And that therefore he should use the power of the Japanese pension fund, which turns out to be the largest pension fund in the world, owning more than 1% of the world's financially traded assets, that they should focus on climate change. That's what led BlackRock to make the first commitments to thinking about climate. Now, to your point, has BlackRock followed through? My goodness, then it starts to get complicated. So we're just at the beginning stages of this. I think that we probably need something that looks like a major moral revolution, that no one would say investing in child labor, you should do it because it's going to raise profits. I mean, after all, children are really cheap and they have these little fingers, great manual dexterity. No one would make that case in public. I think we need to get to the place where we understand that burning fossil fuels, which we are all implicated in, is morally absolutely repellent, and we should be doing everything we can in our power to stop doing it. We don't yet have that kind of moral force.
Thank you, Rebecca. And next question to Praveen. Praveen, I wonder if you want to ask your question about the inherent nature of capitalism.
Sure.
Or
Thank you for being here, Rebecca. I have a lot of questions, but I will ask this one. So what struck me after watching your video is that maybe the current rhetoric around anti-capitalism is sort of a misdirection. What I hate is not capitalism as a tool, but the execution and adaptation of it. What do you think is in the nature of human beings that has led to this version of capitalism? And how do we compensate or address this aspect as we attempt to build a fair market?
Oh, Praveen. So I hinted at that in my answer to the last question. We have created a society and a version of capitalism. When I say we, I mean we rich white privileged people, and kind of imposed it on much of the rest of the world, which has a model of humans which is fundamentally selfish and fundamentally competitive. And we've built a system which reinforces that, right? Here in the US, we put kids into competitive sports at 6 and 7, and the parents run up and down screaming if they lose. I recently heard that in Norway, they won't let the kids play competitive sports until they're 12. But, this constant reinforcement of you're no good if you're not at the top. And we've created a society in which saying something like, well, guys, burning fossil fuels is going to create untold damage on thousands of years to come, on millions of people, and shouldn't we do something different? To say that in a boardroom, unless you're very careful or very senior or very famous, is to be weak and not realistic and not understand realities on the ground, which are compete. So that, I think, we say capitalism, but I think for many people, when they say, I hate capitalism, let's burn it down, what they mean is they hate that sense that all that matters is you, and you're making money right now at everybody else's expense. And so there are sort of two broad paths as we think about rebalancing that. One is to rediscover that we are a collective, democratically, inclusively, to rebuild the institutions of civil society. Easy to say, going to be hard to do. And the second thing we need to do is rebuild our sense of what it means to be human and what the goals of being human are. Because we know from the science, this is the crazy thing, and I bet you wouldn't have asked this question if you didn't know this. We know from the science that what actually makes people happy is cooperation and experiences of awe and the moral beauty of the people they love, and listening to music and dancing together and acting together. Now, of course, everyone needs enough to eat and a safe place to live and decent power. And so it's not like we don't need material things, but past a certain point at which 100 billion is certainly that point, it seems to be about 20,000, depending on how you measure it. What matters is our connections to others and our sense of love and awe. But we've created a society where if there's a spectrum of people, like Praveen, you're out at the extreme, like you're just a saint, you just want access, you just about love and connection and relationship. And at the other end, we've got the people we're promoting to run the system. We're selecting for the people who genuinely think it is only about competition and me, right? And they're in charge. Now, I'm generalizing horribly. I know many very senior leaders who are all over what's happening and really want to make a difference. But I'm caricaturing to make this point that we are wildly out of balance. So when I say I think we need a moral revolution, I'm kind of pointing in this direction. What that looks like, I don't know. The talk about I'm spiritual but not religious, that's super interesting. Historically, we've had, major religious revivals focused on the good of the whole that kind of, tried to pull us back in this direction. But I don't know. I really don't know. Do I think we should all be working on trying to find out what that looks like? Absolutely. And that for me, I come back to the purpose-driven firm. One of the CEOs I work with, he had a revelation. He was at the marriage of one of his employees' children, his employee's daughter. And he looked at her up at the altar and he thought, wait, everyone is someone's precious child. All my employees are someone's precious child. I'm going to run my firm as if everyone is someone's precious child. And the number one skill he teaches, that the firm teaches, is listening, compassionate listening. That's a completely different way to run the firm. And yes, the firm is growing at 17% in a very ordinary market with great profits. But that's just the means to the end. He says what's exciting about it, that firm, is he sees people's relationship. They go home, their relationship with their families are much better, that they're getting involved in local politics. So, we think firms don't have anything to do with this. They have a lot to do with this. This is where people spend most of their time. And if we can create, we're never going to move 100% of firms, but a critical mass of firms that manage in this different way, that show it can be done, whoa, would that be helpful? I think it would.
Rebecca, thank you so much. We could be talking to you all day long. Thank you so much for joining us today for these incredibly insightful perspectives. Our time has come to an end, but thank you so much, everybody, for your very thoughtful questions in chat, for your comments, for your takeaways. Rebecca, I'll share with you just some incredible takeaways from the conversation today that are all blowing up our chat in Zoom here today. Everybody, hope you all have a wonderful day. Remember this conversation. Think about what you can do differently. One League is a place where we want to build conscientious leadership and make a difference in the world. So thank you so much for taking the time to join today. And thank you so much again, Rebecca. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you for the work you're doing. Umaima, thank you for One League. It's amazing. Thank you, everyone who's engaged. And good luck. Together, we can change the world. I really think so. Thank you.